Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lecture we'll continue our discussion on pair grids. Let's start by looking at a simple pair grid. We have seen this at the beginning of the previous lecture. We'll call Seaborn's pair grid function. We'll be using the iris dataset. And let's map this to matplotlib's scatter function. Let's run this. So here we have a pair grid with sepal length, sepal width, petal length, and petal width as variables. Similar to what we did in the PairProt lecture, we can also draw a subset of these variables in our pair grid. That's what we are going to see next. For instance, if I want to see the variables petal length and petal width only, just these two variables, we can do that with pair grids. And for that, we use the vars attribute, vars for variables. So here in our pair grid, we'll simply pass the vars attribute and set it to a list of all the variables that we want to see. In our case, petal length and petal width. Petal length and petal width. Let's run it. Okay, now we have just those two variables, petal length and petal width. And similar to what we did in the previous lecture, we can change the diagonal scatter plots to a different kind. For that, let's pass some other functions. Let's pass the map diagonal and map offset functions. So let's use the map diagonal function, and then let's call matplotlib's histogram function, and let's do the same and apply the map of diagonal function of diag, and let's call matplotlib's scatter function and run it. Okay, now we have histogram as our diagonal and our scatter plots for our petal length and petal width. Another thing we can do is we can add legends. For that, let's first add hues. So species, let's run this, and then we'll call the add legend function. Okay, now we have 3 different colors. It's looking good. So let's call the add legend function. We can say x is equal to x dot add underscore legend. Let's run it again. Now we have our species, setosa, versicolor, and virginica. Another thing we can do is we can call the palette function and use different palette for our pair grid. So we can use one or more of those attributes to our pair grid. One other attribute that we haven't seen so far is known as the edge color. We can apply edge color for our either histogram or scatter plots. Let's see that. So edge color, as its name indicates, this attribute will apply whatever color we pass here to the edges of our graph. For instance, let's apply an edge color of gray for our histogram and run it. Let me zoom in and show you the edge color. So you see here a faint gray color. We can also change this to some other color. Let's try black if it's more visible. Yeah, I think it's a bit more visible. So you can apply different edge colors to your histogram and even to your scatter plot. So we can even add an edge color. Let's try black for our scatter plot and run it. So I think the black one is more visible for our scatter plots, right? The edge colors. And we have a white edge color for our histogram. So those are some attributes that we can apply for our PairGrid. Great. Another thing we can do is we can apply different variables for our rows and columns. For instance, in this example, we have petal length and petal width for both our rows and columns. We can change, for instance, our columns to a different variable. Let's say sepal length and sepal width. For that, we'll have to pass the x vars and the y vars attribute. Let's see how we can do that. So we'll start by calling Seaborn's PairGrid method, PairGrid, and then we'll pass our iris dataset, and let's pass the x vars and y vars attribute. So for x vars, that will be for our columns. Let's pass petal length and petal width, and for our y vars, we'll use sepal length and sepal width. Let's go to a new line, and for y vars, let's set it equal to sepal length and sepal width. And let's map this to our matplotlib's scatter plot and run it. Now we have sepal length and sepal width as our y variable and petal length and petal width as our x variable. Another thing we can do with our PairGrid is show different kinds of plots above the diagonal and below the diagonal. So here, for instance, we have histogram for our diagonal and then scatter plots above the diagonal and below the histogram. By calling the map lower and map upper functions, we can pass different kinds of graphs. That's what we'll see next. Okay, so as usual, we start by calling the PairGrid function, and then we'll pass the iris dataset. Next, let's call the diagonal function. So x.mapDiag, and let's use a different plot for our diagonal. Let's use a histogram. So plt.hist, and for above the diagonal, we'll call the map upper function. So let's call the map upper function, and let's use a scatter plot above our diagonal, and below our diagonal, we'll call the map lower function, and let's use Seaborn's KDE plot, for instance, sns.kde. Okay, let's run it and see what it looks like. Okay, looks good except for the lower part. Here it says module has no attribute KDE. There should be KDE plot, sns.kde plot. Let's run it again. Okay, looks nice. We have our KDE plot for the lower part of our PairGrid, and we have scatter plots for the upper part, and we have histogram for our diagonal. And we can pass some other attributes that we have seen before. Let's first pass hue as species, and then let's call the add legend function x.add legend. Let's run it again. Okay, we have our species Setosa, versicolor, and virginica. Our variables here on the x-axis and on the y-axis. So now we have those legends. Since we added this hue species, we see 3 different KDE plots here, one for each species. Another thing we can do is pass the palette attribute and set it to a different palette. For instance, cool warm. And we have this. Another thing we can do is we can pass or use different markers for our hue. For that, we'll need to pass the hue KWS attribute. By passing that, we can use different markers for our hue, which is species. Let's see an example of that. So we have our SNS that PairGrid function. We'll pass our iris dataset, and for hue we'll be using species, right? And then let's map this to a scatter plot, plt.scatter, and let's simply add a legend, x.add legend. So before I add anything, let me show you what it will look like. So here we have PairGrid, iris, hue, and species. So this is the default one, and what we'll do next is pass the hue KWS attribute. So hue underscore KWS, and we'll set that to different markers for our species. And in order to do that, we'll use a dictionary and then pass key and value attributes. So in this case, let's pass marker as key, and for value, since we have 3 different species, we'll pass 3 different markers as a list. Let's use diamond, a square, and maybe a plus sign as markers. And let's close our parenthesis there. Let's run it again. Here it says unrecognized marker style S. Let's make this small s and run it again. Okay, looks much nicer here. So if you look at the species legend, we have Setosa for diamond, versicolor is square, and virginica is plus sign. It looks small. Let's pass another attribute for our scatter plot. Let's pass the size attribute and set it to maybe 30 and run it again. Okay, it's bigger now. Now you should see the different markers here. We have virginica as plus, Setosa is diamond, versicolor is square. So those are our different markers. Okay, let me copy this, paste it here. Another thing we can do is pass the edge color attribute. Let's use black. I think that will be more visible. And run it again. Okay, it's much more visible now. And again, you can pass one or more attribute, right? For instance, we can pass the palette attribute and use a different palette. Let's use RDBU. It looks nice, I think. So you can pass one or more attributes of your like. So as an exercise, what you can do is you can change this diagonals to different kinds. For instance, you can change it to histogram or some other kind, and you can also apply the map upper and map lower functions to change how the upper or lower part of the pair grid is displayed. You can apply different functions for those, and you can use different markers for your hue. You can use a circle, for instance, and so on. So that's what I have for the lecture on pair grids. Just to summarize, we looked at pair grids in this lecture, and we saw that pair grids are similar to pair plots. One major difference is that we'll have to apply the map function to map our pair grid to different kinds of plots. And by applying one or more attributes, we are able to change the way our pair grid is displayed. We can change the diagonals or the upper or lower part of our pair grids. We can change the palettes. We can add hues and so on. Or even draw a subset of some of the variables. Great. That's what I have for this lecture. Thank you everyone, and see you at the next lecture.